This is a synopsis of our RELS 480 course, Theories and Criticisms of Religion. So the first, part of the course, we looked at the background and origin of the study of religion, religious studies, and interpretive frames and context. So that goes really back to Hayden's book, his first chapter of interpretive frames and how he sees the act and the work of doing the study of religion as interpreting, the sacred. That's a key concept for him in that work. So we looked at Houston Smith as one major definer of religion, because it's always important to know what we're talking about. And he defines religion in the widest sense as a way of life woven around a people's ultimate concerns. And this is in his book, The World's Religions. It's something, as we went through the course, obviously that connects with the thinking of people like Paul Tillich, for example, this idea of the ultimate concern. And then he had, that is, Smith does, this narrower sense, a concern to align humanity with the transcendental ground of its existence. That's his narrower framework. And so we begin then to think about these questions of, like, what then is a religion? Can baseball, shopping be a religion? And then what defines who's part of a religion? Is it being born into that religion? Is it confessing a particular doctrine or truth? For Smith, the importance really is how pervasive the impulse toward religion is and the inclination that people have. And a lot of the thinkers that we looked at share that. As I put here, Paul Tillich talked about the state of being grasped by ultimate concern is one way to look at religion. I then also felt a little bit uncomfortable with that as the only definition. So, especially, as I was beginning my teaching here 10 years ago at Chico State, I wanted to synthesize the definitions of religion that I saw. And so I added a few more pieces to this. I don't love the formulation. It's much harder to remember, but I hope it's a little bit more comprehensive. That is, religion is, quote, the belief in God, many gods, or ultimate reality, as well as an associated organized system of teachings, scriptures, leadership, and ceremonies with rules used to relate to God, a plurality of gods, or ultimate reality. Stephen Prothero, in his book, God is Not One, has that great 4C's schema for understanding religion. It's great because I guess I envy his ability to come up with something that's so memorable. But it is the creed, what is believed, the cultus, the form of worship, the code, the ethical behavior that's outlined in a religion, and then the community of the religion. So another way to define religion, perhaps a little more narrowly, but I think also a little more comprehensively. Then we looked at this, movement that is especially taking hold of a kind of streaming spirituality or an LP religion. So, or the pick and choose spirituality, the individualized spirituality. There's a lot of ways to look at it. I like to think of it as an iPod or an LP. LP being what we often thought about religion. Like there's a catechism of the Catholic Church that you accept or not, and then you become a Catholic. Putting it in real simple terms, that's not fair to all Catholics, of course, but that's one way to see religion. Or you subscribe to the 5 pillars of Islam or some other kind of clear definition. That's what it is to be part of this religion. Whereas an iPod or a streaming spirituality is much more various inputs from even various religions or even pieces that aren't particularly religious. As Cooper said to me, I cherry pick from various religions instead of choosing just one. So then we looked at criticisms of religion and the hermeneutics of suspicion in weeks 3 through 4. And this is the classic trio of atheists. Karl Marx. So these go in historical order. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, who is of Jewish background in a predominantly Christian country of Germany. And his famous statement is, religion is the opiate of the masses. And for him, history and its struggle between the classes is central to understand to his work, which he, definitively expressed in the Communist Manifesto, but of course other writings. And so Marx is one of these early atheists. Early in modernism, there have been atheists for centuries and millennia, but early in terms of influence in the Western European world and therefore the American world as well. Sometimes I find it helpful to carry along a distinction that I learned that of Marxian being Marx's ideas themselves and Marxist, how Marx's followers present his ideas. So, when we talk about, say, Stalin or Mao, those would be more Marxist than Marxian in that distinction. Second one, in terms of sequence in time, is Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, the son of a pastor also in Germany, who announced that God is dead. And announced, I think, is important here because, I wanted to try to get the right word. He felt that what he was doing was telling something that had already occurred, and that is the loss of belief in God in the Western world. So he also then declared that Christianity is immoral. It highlights a kind of ethics that privileges, weakness and a kind of inability to express strength and power and accomplishment. Paraphrasing just a bit, but I think it's not far from the way Nietzsche saw it. And it therefore proclaimed the idea of the Übermensch, often translated the Superman. According to the philosopher Colin Brown, this is the man who realizes the human predicament, creates his own values, and fashions his life accordingly. And in that, you see him, that is Nietzsche, writing important books, two of which particularly stand out: Birth of Tragedy and On the Genealogy of Morals. And there are many, many others, of course. And then finally, in this trio is Sigmund Freud. This might be also, if the trio could be the unholy trinity, since they're all atheists, perhaps. Freud was 1856 to 1939, born into a practicing Jewish family. He declared that religion is an illusion, which for him is a technical psychological term, meaning it's a wish fulfillment. And that comes out of his book, The Future of an Illusion, from 1927. This is the idea that we want a God, particularly a father figure in the sky who will care for us. And so we have an illusion that that's what actually exists. So he began his work in psychoanalysis to understand the truth about religion, and even directly approached Western religion in his book Moses and Monotheism, which he wrote between 1934 and 1938. So this then opens up a more general category of the psychological theories about religion. A psychological approach studies religion as it relates to our minds, to the mind and its functions, especially those affecting behavior in a given context. So religion is an experience of individuals. It's often rooted in the unconscious life, mystical experiences, or neurosis. And this is where obviously Freud would fit, but I would say to some degree Nietzsche as well. In asking questions, what's going on when people report religious experiences? What are the unconscious roots of religious ideas and symbols? I mentioned one of those in Freud's view just a minute ago, that this is this illusion we have of this God, this Father in the sky who takes care of us. So he, had this, Freud particularly had this idea of, from this psychological perspective, which I had to note contrast with Jung, whom I'm going to look at, and we looked at later in the course, that religion is a neurosis, as I mentioned earlier, is an illusion. And he believed there's a power to this idea of the Oedipal complex, where God is a father, and where religion is therefore an obsession with ritual and the veneration of a father figure. And, we have, in Freud's view, all human beings, especially men, have this desire to kill the father and, marry the mother, as he reads in the Oedipus Rex story. So that plays out in his understanding of religion. He also had this theory of the human psyche, that there was the id, the substratum, not always very well articulated or known, of desires and impulses, the ego, which is primarily what the level at which we exist in our consciousness, and the superego, which is the society around us, which informs our ego. But I think what was really important for him was to see that this id is in the unconscious is always bubbling up and affecting our lives. Along with Freud, then, I would add a more contemporary view, which is evolutionary psychology, that takes the theory of evolution, um, which is developed by Darwin in the late 18th, 19th century, and looks at the psychological framework, looks at psychological traits like memory, perception, language as adaptations, as functional products of natural selection. Things like community, the importance of community, of altruism come out of the desire and the need for human beings who are not Homo sapiens, they're not particularly able to defend themselves, the need we have to survive. So in this context, and here I'm drawing on work by David Sloan Wilson, for example, in his book Darwin's Cathedral. David Sloan Wilson is a contemporary thinker. Is the behavior by an animal that is not beneficial to or maybe harmful to itself, but that benefits others of its species. So the question is, with an evolutionary psychological approach, why is there religion? Why is there altruism, which so often religion leads us toward? Buddhists have, for example, a very strong sense that we are to love like a mother loves her child, to love all humanity, and that's compassionately, altruistically. And David Sloan Wilson says that there's the importance here of a group being selected, and altruism is for the sake of the group's survival, which therefore then helps the individuals to survive. Always a good question. Is there one big idea that captivated you in this section or others? And I'm going to ask that question repeatedly, and it's something to keep thinking about, because we, we have this desire to study religion, I think, because we want to ask the big questions and think of the big thoughts that have come through religious thinkers. And maybe there's something else that we'd like to raise, or you'd like to raise as you think about and encounter these people. So then we went into week 5, which is sacred and profane in the history of religions, comparative and phenomenological interpretations of religion. And this really related to the important and influential thinker Mircea Eliade, lived from 1907 to 1986. And he had this idea that religion is its own genus, its own category, you might say. So he's an essentialist. And one way of describing essentialism is that there are essential properties of religion that make it what it is. It's not reducible, that is, religion, to sociology or psychology or other forms of analysis. It's its own kind of thing, its own genus. It's not reducible to a non-religious history. And so Eliade looked at phenomena that makes him a phenomenologist, to understand what is particular about religion. And for him, it's that religious myth and ritual organize the world into sacred and profane spheres and help people make sense of their lives. And so the religious rituals make present again these myths. In weeks 6 through 8, we looked at various liberationist perspectives, feminist perspectives. Rosemary Radford Ruther, the important American Catholic theologian. And one of my students wrote this way about her work, The Feminist Critique in Religious Studies, where she presents how women are excluded in academic and leadership roles in theology. And by excluding women, the male dominant beliefs have flourished. If this continues, women will never have equal representation in Christian faith and traditions. The exclusion of women from leadership and theological education results in the elimination of women as shapers of the official theological culture. Mary Daly. So if we look at Ruther as somebody who was reforming, meaning shifting the paradigm from the inside, but retaining, for her sake, Christianity, Catholic Christianity, Catholicism. Mary Daly shifts the perspectives, more of a revolutionary. She lived from 1928 to 2010, and she taught at Boston College for 33 years. Though she was a practicing Catholic. She disavowed Christianity by the early 1970s. So we read her article, her opening chapter to her book, Beyond God the Father. And she talked about sex role segregation, how studies by women are often trivialized, spiritualized, and universalized, and how she sought an interaction between this insight that this kind of scholarship brings and praxis. And then finally, Rita Gross, who's interesting in a particular way because she doesn't come out of the Western tradition. She's a Buddhist. She lived from 1943 to 2015, and she looks at the effect of the androcentric model of humanity on the scholarship of religion and wants to draw a distinction between women's studies in religion and feminist theology. So really wants to say there's a way in which we can study from the perspective of women and women's viewpoints. And there's another perspective which really puts forward in a way to change things, those views. And so she also then criticizes that so much of feminist theology is solely Christian and added a different voice as a Buddhist. We looked at an article as well called Women in Hindu Traditions. And because of the need to move beyond Christianity, following Rita Gross in some ways, and this looked at the diversity of views about women in Hinduism, various teachings in Hinduism. For example, Maya, which is illusion or magic, is something that's associated with women. Women often in their lives are controlled and protected by men. This can be seen in child arranged marriage. That also in Hinduism, maybe on the other hand, there are a variety of female divinities, deities, goddesses, and therefore the divine can be seen as female or feminine. And also this idea of the androgynes as this balance of equality and symbols of equality and balance. And we got into this discussion and have had this on several iterations of this class about does the ability to see the divine as female look at help women to be brought into this tradition in ways that Western religions, which are almost exclusively male or masculine in understanding and imaging the divine, is it better for women when there are goddesses essentially? So it's always an important question. And in that module, we looked at race, religion, and science. And I'm going to highlight a little bit of this, but I took a moment because of my own specialization to highlight eugenics, this idea of, which I'll get into a little bit more in a minute, but essentially of looking for good birth and how that's connected with a view of racism that was seen as supported by science. This flourished in the United States between 1880 and 1930 and was supported, interestingly, by religious progressives, as Thomas Leonard and illiberal reformers makes clear. So the idea of eugenics is to, in terms of negative eugenics, is to reduce the amount of feeble-minded people in the language of the day. That's quote unquote feeble-minded. As Edward Black describes in War Against the Weak, 27 states in this period sterilized 60,000 people against their will. And as Theodore Roosevelt, our president, once said, quote, "The failure of couples of Anglo-Saxon heritage to produce large families would lead to race suicide." We then also looked into this, and again, I'll just sort of highlight this slide, but it's how there was connected with this, the scientific racism, that I greatly respect science, but I also recognize that science is not necessarily ethically neutral. As Fermi National Accelerator physicist Brian Nord has commented, quote, "Racism in science is enmeshed with the larger scheme of white supremacy in society," end of quote. So when we think of things like the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the African-American male, where Black men were infected with syphilis and were told they were receiving free medical treatment, but were not given any treatment, and they had no knowledge of this, to state the obvious, this 4 decades experiment from 1932 to 1972. This is an example of the kind of scientific racism that occurred. And this is also related to the importance of race in understanding religion. As Martin Luther King Jr. wrote or said, the most segregated hour of Christian America is 11 o'clock Sunday morning. So religion has this racialized component when we study it. And as part of our study, we need to make sure we don't forget that. When we pondered then Cornel West, the contemporary thinker, in the article we read from him, and particularly his concept of the structure of modern discourse, that there are these, quote, controlling metaphors, notions, categories, and norms that shape the predominant conceptions of truth and knowledge in the modern West, and they're determined by the scientific revolution, the Cartesian transformation of philosophy, and the classical revival, end of quote. And then particularly, this fusion creates essential elements of the modern discourse of the West, which by nature is racist and pitched toward northern light-skinned Europeans, as West, who's really memorable with his aphorism, said, "There's a price to pay for speaking the truth. There's a bigger price for living the lie." And he wants to uncover the racism that's part of our culture and part of our religious practice. He does this, by the way, as a person who's explicitly a Christian. So that's a part of this whole teaching he does, or I should say the whole writing and teaching he does. So he teaches now at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. We then moved into sociological and anthropological interpretations of religion. And, looking at sociology as the study of human society at a given period of time. It focuses on the social unit, right? And here's where you could place Marx, although he's also ethical and economic. It's looking at the effect of religion on society and society on religion. Like, what is the relationship between religion and other social systems? How do religious groups form and grow, and how are power and authority managed in religious groups? One key thinker here of the two key thinkers, Durkheim and Weber, is Emil Durkheim. His dates are 1858 to 1917, 1858 to 1917. And as Bella defines the term in Durkheim of society, it is, quote, a composition of beliefs, ideas, and sentiments, and all sorts which realize themselves through the individual. So society moves through us as individuals. It's not like we are first individuals. It's society which is first. So Durkheim was incredibly important in helping us to understand religion. He had this concept of the collective effervescence. When we're in the presence of celebrities or at a sporting event, there's a sacred time where individuals lose themselves into the collective identity by merging joyfully into the common self or clan. And as he writes, quote, "It is in the midst of these effervescent social environments and out of this effervescence itself that religious ideas seem to be born." He also had this concept of the totem and totemism, that is an animal or another or an other natural object that spiritually or symbolically represents a people and their common origin. And then he's full of great ideas and important influential ideas in the elementary forms of religious life. He talked about collective representation, ideas and symbols that carried force in society because they were collectively created. And he believed that he went back to simpler societies, which he called primitive or maybe primal. You could analyze those and see how as society got more developed and complicated, like contemporary society of his day, you could understand it more clearly. So that was his approach. Max Weber, also a sociologist, his dates are 1864 to 1920, so similar time period to Durkheim. Considered himself religiously and musical, and personally had emotional and psychological instability. As his wife Marianne wrote, he was, quote, an eagle with broken wings. So he, though, nonetheless, is one of the most one of the foremost social theorists in the 20th century. He had the idea of the rationalization thesis, a grand meta-historical analysis of the dominance of the West in modern times, and the Protestant ethic thesis, a non-Marxist genealogy of modern capitalism. And as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy writes, quote, together these two theses helped launch his reputation as one of the founding theorists of modernity. So let alone religion, he is understood as a great social theorist and sociologist in many ways. He sought to understand, and the German word here is verstehen, to understand the motives of why people take certain actions. It is a qualitative method used in social science, that is verstehen, to help us understand the reasoning behind actions, putting ourselves in another's shoes. As Max Weber wrote, all knowledge of cultural reality as may be seen is always knowledge from a particular point of view. He also had this idea of the iron cage, which is essentially as the world becomes and the culture becomes more and more rationalized, bureaucratized, it becomes in its way more dehumanized. The iron cage is a threat to individualism and freedom, right? Christianos, Swatos, and Kavistos, excuse me. What Weber says about this quote, no one knows who will live in this cage in the future or whether at the end of this tremendous development, entirely new prophets will arise, or there will be a great rebirth of old ideas and ideals, or if neither, mechanized petrification embellished with a sort of convulsive self-importance. So a little bit of a apocalyptic edge to this idea of the iron cage. Just briefly, we touched on Victor Turner, who was born in 1920 and died in 1983, and the idea of community liminality and communitas, where we go through these times where our old status is stripped away, we move into a liminal status and to a new status through rites of reincorporation. This is significant for religions, and it is significant as we go from in this in-between stage, the idea that emerging adults in the way they view religion are looking at religion because they're in this in-between stage between adolescence and adulthood, between 18 and 35 in our contemporary culture. The idea that a monk, Buddhist monk going through an initiate going to become a monk goes through initiation rites to do that is important. A person going into becoming a Catholic goes through various rites to reaffirm their faith, and in the old days, at least, to have their first communion. Here is a paint. And by the way, when I was in Sicily and in Italy, you can see sometimes those first communion moments and how important they are in a Sunday dinner after church, where like the whole family's there and there's presents and everybody's dressed up, and the importance of that moving through that liminal stage to a new stage of connection with the religious tradition of Catholicism. My sister-in-law, Melinda Kutsona, has painted liminality, and here's one of a man falling, not yet falling, hitting the new level that he's moving to, nor where he's come from, but that sense of being in between. That's a sense of then that often is a time of change, which is related sometimes also to conversion and recommitment. We look at W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, an American sociologist, historian, author, editor, and activist, important in the Black protest movement in the United States. He shared in the creation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. His famous sociological study in 1899 is the Philadelphia Negro. It's been said it's perhaps the finest example of engaged sociological scholarship, the kind of work that in contemplating social reality helps to change it. In his book, The Souls of Black Folks, he talks about double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Briefly looked at Peter Berger's idea of the heretical imperative. Berger, late 20th, early 21st century sociologist, this idea that we have to choose, and the heresy comes from a Greek word hierein, which means to choose. And so we are defined in religion today by needing to choose. That's one thing. We don't just feel we are born into a religion and therefore it's ours. We are forced in many ways by society and culture to choose it. He also talked about secularization, which for him was a kind of idea following Weber that he ascribed to, but gradually, and especially toward the end of his life, he believed that actually we're not secularized, that we have become religious in new ways in contemporary culture. As he wrote in 2008, modernity is not characterized by the absence of God, but by the presence of many gods. We looked in weeks 11 through 13 at religion and personality with Carl Jung, who was born in 1875 and died in 1961. He said that, as Jung, individuation is to divest the self of false wrappings. And he had this idea not of the unconscious in Freud, of an individual unconscious, maybe in the id, as one place, quote, place that exists, but as something that exists among human beings. It has been defined by Encyclopedia Britannica as that is the collective unconscious as, quote, a form of the unconscious, that part of the mind containing memories and impulses of which the individual is not entirely aware, common to mankind as a whole and originating in the inherited structures of the brain. According to Jung, the collective unconscious contains archetypes or universal primordial images and ideas. So it's this innate tendency that drives and shapes us that Jung said he could find through his psychological work with patients. He also had this concept of the archetype. He wrote, the archetype concept derives from the often repeated observation that myths and universal literature stories contain very well-defined themes which appear every time and everywhere. We often meet these themes in the fantasies, dreams, delirious ideas, and illusions of person living nowadays. So the myths of the past are represented in the contemporary experience that of any human being, and there are things like dreams and illusions and so on. Finally, week 14, we looked at religion from the inside, religious and theological interpretations of religion. The key figure here was Paul Tillich, the German-born Christian systematic theologian, born in 1886, died in 1965. And he adapted Eliade's theories about religions to his work as a Christian theologian. His idea, as I've quoted before, is that religion is about ultimate concerns. And he began increasingly to take on the study of comparative religion that Eliade developed and work that into the theological framework of the specific religion of Christianity. This would be Protestant Christianity, particularly. He saw that religion is a part of all of human life, and this has him join hands with many of the thinkers of the course. Quote, if religion is present in all functions of the spiritual life, why has mankind developed religion as a special sphere? The answer is because of the tragic estrangement of man's spiritual life from its own ground and depth. According to the visionary who has written the last book of the Bible, there will be no temple in the heavenly Jerusalem, for God will be all in all. Will be in all. There will be no secular realm. For this very reason, there will be no religious realm. Religion will be again what it is essentially, the all-determining ground and substance of man's spiritual life. So religion is a pervasive aspect, or maybe that's itself contradictory. Religion is pervasive throughout human life, and it is connected deeply with culture and art as well. To contrast him, we looked at the systematic theologian Karl Barth, also born in 1886, died in 1968. In his article, an article about him by Robert Jensen, who looked at Barth and the way that he brought a postmodern view and challenged the modern liberal view of religion, of which Tillich would be one example. This idea of the human individual, this idea of from Kant of the Critique, that we can look at life and analyze it in a kind of detached way. The idea of metaphysics as a mechanism. In other words, that the ultimate structure of the universe is mechanical. And what Jensen argues that Barth carried the Enlightenment critique of religion to its final possibility. And what he did in this then is to emphasize the specific revelation that's contained and expressed through the words of the Bible, that is actually God's speech to humanity. And that our call as human beings is not to look internally to what Friedrich Schleiermacher talked about, the feeling of absolute dependence, but to look, and even more to listen to God's voice in the Bible. So with both of these thinkers, Tillich and Barth, we were trying to finish off this course by looking from the inside and to try to see how most people view religion, even if they are trying to understand the variety of religions in the world. They look at it from the inside. And Barth focusing on the specificity of the Christian tradition as a way to understand human experience. Tillich looking as a Christian at the universality of human experience as a way to understand Christianity. So once again, as I summarize RELS 480, the question is there one big idea that captivated you in this course? And is there something else, some other idea you'd like to raise?